Thank you, everyone. We'll start our next panel now. Thank you. We'll start our next panel, Great Power Competition in the Arctic. This is moderated by Dr. Rebecca Pincus, Assistant Professor, Strategic and Operational Research Department, Center for Naval Warfare Studies, U.S. Navy War College. Rebecca, thank you.
Thank you, Mike. And thank you all for being here. I'm really grateful to our incredible panel of experienced and brilliant speakers whom I'm not going to introduce because their bios are in the booklet, but I'm really looking forward to what they have to say to us today. They're going to be sharing perspectives from outside of the United States on great power competition, or what the National Defense Strategy refers to as long-term strategic competition. I'm sure you've all heard this term tossed around a lot today. And sort of in the general discourse around Arctic security issues. When we think about great power competition, we can look at the National Defense Strategy, we can look at the National Security Strategy, which referred to growing political, economic, and military competition, which is not passing or momentary, but is intertwined, long-term challenges that demand our sustained national attention and commitment. In Finland, in May, Secretary Pompeo asked rhetorically, do we want the Arctic Ocean to transform into a new South China Sea? So in this context, the first question that I'm going to ask our panel to share their thoughts on is the Arctic still a zone of peace? How should we think about this idea of great power competition or power politics in the Arctic Ocean? So I'm going to ask them all to address that question for a few minutes, and then we'll move into Q&A. I have been authorized by Mike to take questions from the audience. So please come up to the microphones, and we want to take your questions. And we have, as I said earlier, a fantastic panel. I'm going to stop talking and leave it up to them. We'll start with Andrei.
Thank you. My name is Andrey Bondarev. I'm head of the economic office of the Russian embassy in Washington, D.C. And when I was invited to speak in this panel, I asked a question. Maybe it's at the beginning we should put a question mark at the end of the name panel because we have doubts that indeed what's going on in the Arctic currently could be called a great power competition. So because we, Russia, we consider Arctic as a territory of peace, stability, and constructive cooperation. Of course, Arctic makes a large part of our economy and historically was a part of our country, part of our economy. It amounts to some estimates from 10 to 15% of GDP, 20% of exports, 80% of all resources of natural gas are located in the Russian Arctic, and this is the interest. This is why this is the interest, natural interest for us to go there to develop the region. It's not. There are many words that were said regarding the climate change and the melting ice, but this is not the only trend behind the increasing interest for our country for developing the Arctic. There are many trends, collision of many trends at the same time. It's also the development of technology. There is also the new strategic view, the necessity of developing the country in itself to expedite the economic growth, to solve the socio-economic issues of the remote regions, population of the remote regions, and of course the slowing production of the traditional oil and gas deposits in the West Siberia. There are many trends inside in one place, and what is more important that we see. What we do currently cannot be should be considered broadly from our vision of Arctic. We're developing the Arctic. It couldn't be considered separately from when we're going with the country, using developing the transit potential of the country for providing the transit route for exporting, providing goods from east to west, developing the basic transport infrastructure for development of the whole part of the Arctic regions of the Russian Arctic. And this is why the Northern Sea Route just part of them as a Trans-Siberian Railway, as a Baikal-Amur Magistral Railway, and as the Northern Latitudinal Railway that's going to be built across the northern part of Ural Mountains. So what we have currently, we are working on improving the investment climate in the Russian Federation, and there is a big competition, as we can say, competition for investors. We're working on the new strategy, how to put all the priorities for development Arctic through 2035. We are currently working the legislation that provides stimulus for investors to invest in the Russian Arctic. So if there is a competition in place, we're competing just for investors. What else? We do not see any place for conflict in the Arctic because, for example, taking a look at our neighbors, we have established sea boundaries with both with the United States and both Norway. Russia is the third closest neighbor of the United States. We have Arctic Council as a body for international cooperation, well-established body with a good spirit of productive dialogue. We would like to use the same sample of cooperation all around the world in different international fora. And what is important that both during the United States chairmanship in the Arctic Council and in the ministerial declaration after the meeting in Fairbanks, and there was no declaration in Rovaniemi, but that was a joint statement that all the countries confirmed their adherence to the stability, peaceful, and cooperation in the region. Of course, there were issues raised during the morning sessions and during the morning session specifically regarding the necessity for creating a forum for discussing military issues which are outside the scope of Arctic Council. So this is a very important part. We're absolutely supportive of that, and we put forward the idea of resuming the full-scale military and political dialogue which took place until 2014, that there were annual meetings of the heads of chiefs of staffs of military forces of all Arctic nations. Of course, it's very important to reestablish this forum for cooperation, starting from the expert level. The list of issues could be extensive. It's establishing direct lines from preventing the incidents outside the national borders, both on the sea and in the air. It could be inviting observers to military exercises. It could be military memorial work. It could be prevention of catastrophes, oil spill, search and rescue operation as well. Thank you. Now I stop here and pass the floor to the other speaker.
Thank you, Andre. Heather?
Great, thanks. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I just first want to share with you a little story. Thanks, Becca, so much for inviting me here. Becca and Andre and I had dinner at a Russian restaurant just on the topic of Arctic cooperation. Andre did us the favor of ordering many special delicacies, borscht and dumplings, and 5 desserts. And he got no protests from Becca and I. So when they delivered these 5 desserts to our table, he leaned and he said, "Now that is collusion." And I'm also very happy to be here with Rob Huebert. Some of you may know he was actually my PhD supervisor. And we have famously different opinions on this matter. So it's always a pleasure when the student becomes the master. So I'm very much looking So just very quickly, I only have 3 slides plus this one. But as a question mark, is there great power competition in the Arctic? I'm not so convinced either. Competition could have different definitions, but certainly is there potential for conflict? Not a likely potential for certain. And so I do believe that the Arctic is a zone of peace. It is a zone of peace. There has not been conflict there since World War II. And especially since Gorbachev and the Arctic Council and all those things, it's well established, and all the Arctic states have said that it is such, and simply it is such, objectively. Why is that? It's because we all have the same interests. which is to develop the region economically. That is our primary interest. And it's maybe not every indigenous people's interest, but is the state's interest, I believe. There isn't much to compete over, and that is because almost all the resources already fall within our 200-mile exclusive economic zones. The extended continental shelf claims are still a little bit up in the air, but I wouldn't characterize that as a competition. It's an oligopoly. All of a sudden, there's Canada, Denmark, and Russia are the three-way winners of the race for a new ocean, although I hate to use the word race in the context of the Arctic. But I'm just saying we have nothing to compete. We have the same interests. We're all the cat that caught the canary, so to speak, with extended continental shelf claims. And then even the fisheries in the Central Arctic Ocean, that's kind of settled for the time being. So there's nothing to fight over. There's certainly nothing to invade. The bigger problem in the Arctic is that people have too much of it. Not that there's not enough. Not that you need to fight somebody or invade something to get more. It's that we all have so much, it's a hard time for us to control and provide stewardship over it. And the last thing, because we're in the States, I just want to mention, I think the only thing, a year ago I said there was no potential for conflict, but the stream of navigation thing between Canada and U.S. is causing some consternation, but that would certainly be an own goal if we had a conflict over that. So, and just as an intellectual kind of a thought exercise before I go on, people talk about the potential for competition or conflict in the Arctic in the very abstract. They just say, in the Arctic. And of course, Rebecca has this good slide, that shows that the Arctic is actually quite a large place and quite a diverse place. People never say where that conflict would be. Where would it be over? What part of the Arctic would it be in? What would be the interest that people were actually fighting over? Why would anyone fight in the Arctic over the Arctic? So I've never heard a satisfactory response to that. If you have one, I'd love to hear it over the break. But in general, no one sees that there's potential for conflict because there's nowhere that makes sense. There's nowhere that would be in states' interest to do so. So from my perspective, I think we need to move away from the asking kind of the traditional realist, liberal, he said, she said, dog and pony show that me and Rob and many others are guilty of saying, is there or isn't there potential for conflict? And move away to the constructivist perspective, which is to say, how do we make sure that it is peaceful and it is stable and continues to do that? So the obvious way for me, and certainly Senator King spoke to some of this, maybe inadvertently, are confidence building efforts. And some of these have already been very successful. I think the Arctic Coast Guard Forum is a tremendous model. And I agree with Andre. There was the Arctic Chiefs of Defense Staff, an Arctic Security Roundtable that was also mentioned. I think it's probably time to reinstate that if we are serious about peace and stability. Here's my last slide, Becca. A little bit of a provocative proposal. In addition to reinstating the Arctic Coast Guard, the Arctic Chiefs of Defense Staff Forum, I think that we should consider declaring the Arctic a neutral area. And I know, I call him Dr. Doom, and he calls me Kumbaya. So I know that sounds Kumbaya off the bat. But the idea is that the Arctic has been very responsive to speech acts, to symbolic acts, from the Mermang speech to the Ilulissat Declaration to the establishment to create an Arctic Council. Those things cost nothing. They required nothing. And I think, we need to move away from the scramble for the Arctic narrative that the average person certainly buys into. Certainly the average person thinks that there is a potential for conflict, even though experts generally don't think that there is, and somehow reframe that narrative. And I think just having a symbolic agreement or signing or some kind of declaration where we said, we're going to remove the Arctic. There is great power competition, but it's not in the Arctic. It's global great power competition. I think even Rob and I would agree that when the U.S. or NATO and Russia and China have competition, the Arctic is just by virtue of being part of the world, by being part of the globe, but it's not over the Arctic itself, that it's kind of tangential. So we don't want militarization. I don't think anyone wants, I think people might want disarmament. I don't think disarmament is possible or feasible or likely. And so in the middle of that, I think stating out loud what is already the practice, what is already the status quo, that the Arctic is compartmentalized, that the Arctic is neutral, I think could move us away from this scramble for the Arctic narrative that I think is the greatest risk to peace in the Arctic right now.
Thank you, Heather. Rob?
Well, thank you very much. Now, as I say, for something a little bit different. First of all, I'd just like to thank John, Becca, and Mike for their invite to participate in this event. I've been participating since the very beginning when the title, if you'll recall, was operating in an ice-free Arctic until, of course, Lawson pointed out that ice was going to be remaining. So it is indeed a privilege to be here. I take a somewhat different view. I would argue that instead of talking about are we entering into a new set of competition, the reality is that we have been in what I have termed a new Arctic Strategic Triangle environment, or NASTY, since 2007. When we start talking about the Arctic, once again, so much of what's happening from the great power security perspective is going unknown or under the water, pun intended in this particular context, that in fact that we have entered into a security dilemma. And what is driving this security dilemma is the reality that the great powers of today's international system, United States, Russia, and increasingly China, have core security interests that are in the Arctic. Now, what this means ultimately is that Heather's right. It's not about a conflict over the Arctic. Andre and Heather are completely correct when they say we're not going to be fighting over Article 76, but it's having a conflict from the Arctic. And this is because the power base, the core security requirements, particularly for the Russians and the Americans, emanate from the Arctic. The diminishing ice is an intervening variable. It's not a causal factor. It's intervening in the context that now the Americans and the Russians have to start focusing on their surface capabilities, but it's intervening. It is not causing this great competition. And unlike the Cold War period, we are not talking about a bipolar security dilemma. We are talking about a tripolar security dilemma, which means that this is vastly more complicated, it is vastly more dangerous, and we must remember that we cannot automatically assume that the Russians and the Chinese will have complete security, cooperation, and the same interests. So what are the core variables that we need to be watching for as this security dilemma continues to expand? Well, we need the existence of great powers who are saying they are great powers and who are asserting themselves as opposed to cooperating. We need geography, and in this case it happens to be Arctic, and we need weapon technology that is particularly of utility in the region. And in this context, it has been the SSNs, the SSGNs, and we are moving now into a period of hypersonic, long-range, maneuverable cruise missiles, which of course then say Arctic. Now, where does the security dilemma begin? We can trace it back to 2007 because, as many of you will recall, it was at the Munich Security Conference when Putin, of course, said that the era of cooperation with the West was over, that the United States and NATO had basically become a security threat to Russia, and that Russia would be asserting its own power. In the defense expenditures of 2008 to 2015, we then see the Russians decide to reinvigorate their nuclear deterrent as an increasingly assertive power. Remember, it was Canada, United States, Norway that provided billions of dollars to help the Russians/Soviets basically dispose of the Soviet-era submarine period, and at this point, they begin the rebuilding. The Russians have nuclear deterrence as the Americans, as all the other nuclear powers, as their core security requirements. But geography requires, combined with technology, that the Arctic has to be the focal point for the Russian state. So the Russians, to great extent and effort, have rebuilt their deterrent. The logic then is as they have rebuilt their deterrent, they have then rebuilt, as they can afford, their aerospace defense of the deterrent. And we can see this in the period from 2010 to the current era when, of course, they are reopening the air bases. What that has resulted in a Russia that is now an Arctic hegemon. But be very clear. They're not doing it in the context that they see a necessity for war in the Arctic, but that is the core Russian security requirement. Now, what happens on the American side is the Americans have always maintained their submarine capability. So once again, even when we're talking cooperation, they were there. Remember, the Virginia class was not supposed to be Arctic capable, but we know from the ICEX operations that they are. So the Americans have always maintained the ability to keep their submarine force, even though it's out of the picture. Now, for the Americans, the crux of the security dilemma is, of course, the refocus on a homeland security against missile threat. So once again, where do we look for where the Americans have placed us? We're talking about Fort Greely with the intermediate interceptor missiles. We're talking about the successor to the DEW line, the Northern Watch system with Canada, and we're talking about the base in Thule. Now, we see the Americans at one point pulling away and then reinvigorating on this system. Following the Ukrainian crisis of 2014, we then see the Americans also recognizing the need for a surface capability in the Arctic. And this is basically manifested in the closer cooperation with its northern NATO partners, with the reactivation of the Second Fleet, and the realization that they now have to start focusing on this particular context. But look at how these two factors are interplaying with each other. The Americans are moving to an anti-missile capability as a core security requirement that has to be placed in the Arctic. The Russians are moving to the protection of nuclear deterrence, which means inherently it has to respond to the American efforts to have an anti-missile capability. And so these two factors are playing against each other. The reality is, as long as the core political interests of the two states are relatively cooperative, those can be papered over, ignored, and we can pretend we're in a cooperative international regime. When the core interests, such as over Ukraine, NATO expansion, however you want to express it, start to spill over into the actual interaction between the two states, then, of course, the Arctic becomes of a critical element. Add the third piece of the triangle, China. China asserts itself as a global power in 2002 when its defense budget goes from the size of Canada's defense budget to now being the second largest defense budget at approximately $220 billion, following the American budget of around $630. The Chinese do not have the same core security requirements that the Americans and Russians have, but they cannot allow the Americans and the Russians to have a safe zone in the Arctic. So we can expect to see their submarine force, particularly their Type 93s and 95s, become Arctic capable in the near future. So where does this leave us? Well, the idea that we can somehow multilateralize the core security requirements of Russia and the United States just simply is not happening. That is why the Arctic Council, why the Americans required that the Arctic Council have that clause that said it will not deal with hard security issues. The Americans have always said, our core security requirements are ours. We do not multilateral it. We are locked in a security dilemma, and we should not try to downplay it. And ultimately, the last point I'll leave, the 800-pound gorilla that we have in the room, when we talk about ultimate political intent of the nations, if in fact security forces and intelligence agencies of Canada, Britain, United States are saying that the Russians are trying to interfere in the overall political organization of the states that we are talking about, and we can presume that we are probably trying to do the same to the Russians, if you have that type of capability now under the hybrid warfare system that we're in, can you really talk about true Arctic security cooperation? Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. That was energetic. So we've heard a variety of viewpoints, which we anticipated. This should be a fun panel to engage with. Again, please field some questions our way, but I'm going to first ask Andre and then Heather to pick up where Rob left off, because I did want to ask specifically about China in the Arctic. We hear a lot about that. So can both of you offer some comments on that prospect or follow up on some other points that Rob launched? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. First of all, let me just a few points in response to what Rob had just said. First of all, as was called Russia reopen the basis, so all discussion regarding this issue should be also taken into account the point that in the 90s, there was a desperate, at some point, a desperate economic situation in the country. Many of our Arctic infrastructure, and it also relates to the population of the Arctic region, it was lost, it was abandoned, it was lost, and there was the population of sub-regions of the Arctic. So what we are currently doing, we're doing within the concept of, it could be called pragmatic sufficiency. There is no way, I don't want to cause danger to any other lands with our activity. We're just establishing what we're doing. We are establishing infrastructure that's necessary just for protecting sovereignty and national security interests, and nothing else, and we don't want to cause any trouble and any danger to any other, our neighboring countries. Second point, which we'd like to make specifically, we try to prevent, which Rob just said, what we try to do for this year, starting 2014, we try to prevent Arctic from any controversies and differences that we have with the United States and other countries in other regions of the world. This is why Arctic is one of those few settings where, for example, for Russia and the United States currently cooperate in the different in various issues. For example, the jewel of our cooperation is cooperation between the Coast Guards, within many forums, Arctic Coast Guard Forum, North Pacific Forum, and the cooperation between the United States Coast Guard and our Ministry of Transportation, oil spill preparedness. Regarding China, this is the question is supposed to be asked here. So China is a big investor to the project like Yamal LNG. Almost 40% belong to the Chinese investors. We actually welcome all the investors from all the country to the Russian Arctic. China, for example, if you take, there was a big forum in April in St. Petersburg Arctic Territorial Dialogue. On the sidelines of the forum, there was an agreement signed for establishing Arctic Research Center between Russian and Chinese entity, and was the first scientific expedition for studying the ice situation along the Northern Sea route will be launched next year. Now they're in the preparation process, for example. So we invite all China and all the investors to the Russian Arctic, but we need more. For example, many things said about China, but for example, which is missed sometimes in the media. For example, on the sidelines of the G20, Japan became the part of the next Arctic LNG project. They acquired, two Japanese companies acquired shares in the Arctic, in the second Novatek project in the Arctic. So what is quoted here is, of course, the statement from it's called the White Book, or the right name is Chinese Arctic Policy, that China declared itself as a near-Arctic state. We do not see any international, international law supports this statement, and we are absolutely sure that Arctic states bear responsibility for sustainable development of the whole Arctic region. But at the same time, what is sometimes missed when you quote the statements like from the White Book is that in the same document, China clarifies that they are going to respect the international law and sovereignty of the Arctic states and the jurisdictions of Arctic states, which is sometimes lost when China is discussed, Chinese role is discussed in the Arctic. Thank you. I stop here.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Heather?
I found it interesting that Senator King was excited about China calling itself a near-Arctic state, because I thought Maine was the near-Arctic state. But I think that speaking about United States, Russia, and adding China in the same breath when you talk about Arctic security flatters China. They just don't have the expertise, the capabilities, and I don't believe either the will to engage in Arctic security issues. Let me tell you that Poland has more Arctic research and more Arctic research output than China. South Korea and Japan have icebreakers. I mean, they're not the first place to get an icebreaker. I think it's because you call it a nuclear icebreaker that people think it's some kind of military missile. I just don't understand what the excitement is over China in the Arctic. So that's my opinion about China. I will say it's not a mystery why they're interested. It's because they want resources. But guess what? Canada wants to sell resources. Russia wants to sell resources. Greenland and Alaska also want to sell resources. So by and large, we are willing sellers, and we're hoping that they're willing buyers. I never understood why Canada has whole Asia-Pacific corridors and trade delegations and missions to get China to buy, but as soon as it's north of 60, all of a sudden it's a security and sovereignty issue. It's very much an emotional issue, and I don't think there's a good basis to look at China and say that they're an Arctic or a near Arctic power.
Thank you, Heather. I'm going to pivot slightly. If we have no questions from the audience, then is there a question over there?
Yep.
Okay, great.
Thank you. Most interesting. Thank you very much. You're very provocative and certainly raise some significant questions. I certainly agree that there is a great need for a structure for discourse in the Arctic region, and particularly maybe focused on the Bering side, but both sides. Certainly on the Bering side, the commerce is growing significantly between Russia and China, both in terms of oil, gas, in terms of shipping. Destinational shipping mainly. Quite a lot of it projected into the future surely will grow. I don't see that particularly as a bad thing. That's commerce. And given the U.S. having very scant capabilities in that part of the world, maybe the U.S. will benefit from that growth. And in terms of China's Polar Belt and Road and its science and inquiries, it's quite significant and moves forward in a very long-term plan. And so it looks like Canada, Russia, China, U.S. on the Bering side. And I wonder, from the context of, is this going to be another South China Sea or security questions, whether we might look at things from the perspectives of those who are participating. If I'm Russia, I see NATO enlargement. I wonder, is that going to happen in my part of the world? If I'm Canada or Russia and I see that the United States doesn't view internal waters, or how we designate as internal waters, but international straits, that's an issue. There are certainly issues that have been unfolding and are unfolding. And if we look at that, the U.S. is not likely, other than maybe its deep military, to be a dominant force in terms of commerce in the region anytime soon. I wonder, do we have to be? I am an American. Do we have to be? Is it necessary to be the dominant force in all parts of the world, or most parts of the world? And to the extent that there will be other powers, i.e. China and probably others as well, developing interests, certainly as the Central Arctic Ocean opens, then there's a question of standards of international law and what law will apply and who gets to define it, and will it fall within the same frame of reference as what some people might call U.S. definition, or would there be a more multilateral definition, or a definition coming from other sources in some way to keep the cooperative spirit that has certainly defined the Arctic.
Anita.
Thank you, Anita.
So,
you've given us a lot to chew on,
the
so I'm just going to
question
break in real
what
quick.
do you think?
Because we have about 2 minutes left to unpack that question. Anyone? 30 seconds?
Well, just very quickly on the Canada-U.S., and this gets to the heart of how we understand the security. I mean, when you hear the Secretary of State identifying Russia and China as new security threats in the Arctic, but at the same time saying that we need to be concerned about maintaining international waters, which means basically challenging Canada in the Northwest Passage. This is the part that gets bizarre for Canadians, because if you're truly talking about defending against the Chinese and the Russians in the long term, Why, for heaven's sake, would you ever want to internationalize the Northwest Passage and to give transit rights, which means that submarines from China and Russia then have the right to go through the Northwest Passage? So we have troubles. For the commerce question, we have issues in Canada right now because a lot of people believed China when they said they wanted to follow rule of law, they wanted to be cooperative, they wanted to play by the rules when it comes to the Arctic. But Canada got a very rude wake-up with China when all we did following the rule of law arrested a senior Chinese executive, and as a result, there have been, once again, getting to the commerce point, they have immediately stopped trade with Canada. They have arrested 2 of our nationals. So this problem of trying to anticipate, even though China says it wants to be productive, we found they only want to be productive as long as their core interests aren't challenged. Economics be damned.
I'll just very quickly add on the concept of competing with Russia or trying to keep up with Russia. We have to appreciate that Russia, their Arctic is infinitely more important to them in terms of GDP than it is to us. The Alaskan Arctic is a fraction of a percentage of US GDP. The Canadian territories are a fraction of a percentage of Canadian GDP, and Greenland is a fraction of a percentage of Danish GDP. For Russia, it's 15 to 20%, so it makes sense that they want to have more icebreakers and more bases and more infrastructure because it's a huge part of their economy.
Andre, final remarks?
Thank you. First of all, I remember then when we are working together, first of all, I would like to thank Wilson Center not only for inviting me, but for helping me during my work here in Washington, D.C., because you know the well-established, the rules I adopted by IMO, first rules I adopted in the first for regulation of marine routes through the Bering Strait, and the first contacts which allow our agencies, Coast Guard and Ministry of Transportation, to establish the contacts and come up for this, to finalize this regulation. They happen thanks to the Wilson Center and the help of my colleagues and our partners from the Wilson Center. And I would like to thank you for that opportunity to provide the task. And that's first. And at the last, I would like to make one quote, and I gave the permission for a few quotes, just a few sentences for you. Today we have the 17th of July, 19. Exactly a year ago, 2 men wrote an article exactly at the same time. It's called US-Russia Can Look North to the Arctic to Find Common Ground. Just a few quotes from this. It happened just right after the Helsinki summit. Coming out of the Helsinki summit, most observers and analysts will be talking about US-Russian relations in the Arctic about as much as they did in the eve of the meeting. Hardly at all. But amid all the concerns and scandal, and perhaps even more so because of them, we shouldn't forget an area of ongoing positive and productive relations between our 2 nations. Addressing practical Arctic maritime issues, enhancing collaborative research, and linking our 2 nations to the economic opportunities in the region have merit. Overarching goal is to maintain the Arctic as a peaceful region, exemplified by broad cooperation among the Arctic states, and perhaps serve as a foundation and framework for inching closer to a more productive relationship elsewhere in the world. Mike Sfraga and Lawson Brigham.
Thank you, Andre. Thank you to this wonderful panel.
Thank you very much. And that gets Andre free access to this conference. Thank you very much. Great work, Becca. Thank you so much, and thanks to the panel.